He moved like time had slowed just for him. Franklin Adams didn't shuffle because he was weak. He moved slow because he'd learned over 84 winters that most things weren't worth rushing for. Not pain, not applause, not even warm bread on a cold Ohio morning. But that didn't mean he didn't feel the cold. His fingers, curled around the frayed strap of a reusable bag, clutched tighter as a northern gust cut through his Army-issue jacket. Olive green, patched at both elbows, still carrying the faint scent of oil and gun grease from decades past. The name tag above the left chest pocket was barely readable anymore. F. Adams. Most people didn't even look long enough to notice. He stepped out of Ray's deli with 3 things: a small loaf of sourdough, a pack of Ricola cough drops, and a postcard addressed to Cadet Tyler Adams, his grandson, stationed in Colorado Springs. "Proud of you," it read, "and your damn posture, Grandpa." He had folded it neatly, like a field report, and tucked it inside his jacket. Across the street, laughter broke against the morning fog like glass. The Rusty Crow Tavern never really closed, not in spirit. By 9 a.m., the regulars were leaning on their chrome-plated machines, beers in hand, boots kicked up on sidewalk curbs like they owned the town. And maybe, in a way, they did. No one challenged them, not anymore. Frank didn't make eye contact, not out of fear. He'd faced fire that melted skin. He'd pulled 2 bodies out of a burning Humvee outside Fallujah before the hatch blew. But that was 1991, and this was a Thursday morning. His cane tapped rhythmically on the pavement, a slow, steady metronome. Tick, tick, then catch. He didn't realize his coat had brushed a handlebar until the motorcycle rocked. Slightly. It didn't fall. It barely moved. Still, Frank stopped dead in his tracks. He turned with care, hands raised slightly, like he was back in Baghdad explaining to a 19-year-old PFC not to panic over a false IED alarm. "Didn't mean to touch it, son," he said with a soft smile. "Jacket's thicker than I thought." He didn't mock, didn't chuckle, just nodded politely and turned to continue on. But one of the bikers, the tallest, bulkier than the rest, mirrored shades glinting, stepped forward. "You deaf or just slow, old man?" Frank paused. "Both," he said simply, "and a little tired, if I'm honest." The punch didn't come with a warning. It was a slap, a hard, backhanded one, angled perfectly to jar the teeth loose without drawing too much blood. Frank's head snapped sideways, glasses flying. His legs gave out under the surprise, not the force. He hit the sidewalk in a clumsy fold, elbow scraping concrete, bag tearing, bread rolling into the gutter. No one moved. A woman glanced from inside a bakery, then looked away. A couple crossed the street, careful not to make eye contact. The bartender inside the Crow reached for his mop bucket. Frank didn't scream, didn't yell. He pushed up slowly on one knee, grabbed the dusty bread, now stained with oil, and placed it gently back in the torn bag like it was a wounded soldier. His jaw throbbed, but he didn't touch it. Pride was louder than pain. The biker laughed. "Should have watched where you're going, Gramps." Frank limped toward a bus bench. He had no intention of catching a bus. He just needed to sit. The metal was cold. So was the silence. His ears buzzed, not from the hit, but from the cheap hearing aid on his right side. He adjusted it with 2 fingers and exhaled, slowly. His heart didn't pound fast, not anymore. It just thumped, like an old engine down to its final gears. Back in 1970, Frank had carried a radio unit the size of a microwave through jungle terrain in Laos. No GPS, just coordinates burned into memory and instinct. He remembered the static. He remembered the words, "Eagle 6, this is Ghost Echo." Fire team pinned near Ridge 31. Casualties. Need extract. Today, the radio was gone, but the call sign remained. He reached into his coat, past the postcard, past the keys he never used anymore, and found a small, battered flip phone. The kind you could run over with a truck and it'd still dial 911. There was only one number saved under emergency, Eagle 6. He tapped once. No words, no panic. He closed the phone, placed it back in his coat, and leaned back on the bench. Minutes passed. The biker bragged inside to his friends. "Walked right into it," he laughed. "Whole town saw it." Frank stared across the street where someone had dropped a newspaper in a puddle. The headline read, "Town Council approves new data surveillance upgrade for school campuses." He blinked once. The noise came not from sirens, but from the air itself. A low, whirring hum, the kind that you don't notice until glasses on the diner tables begin to tremble. A few heads turned, then more. The bartender stepped outside, narrowing his eyes at the horizon. That's not a truck. No, it wasn't. From beyond the tree line, slicing through the sky like vengeance with blades, came a Black Hawk UH-60, military gray, nose tipped low, speed unholy. Phones flew out. Someone whispered, "What the hell?" The helicopter banked hard, descended fast. Dust spiraled up from the empty lot behind the diner. Dogs barked from inside pickup trucks. The wind lifted awnings. And then came the SUV. Matte black. Federal plates. No markings. It screeched to a halt in front of the Rusty Crow. 2 doors opened simultaneously. 4 men stepped out. Then 4 more. Tactical vests, earpieces, fingerless gloves. No shouting, no rush. Every movement looked rehearsed. Like they'd done this 1,000 times. Because they had. The last man stepped from the helicopter. No helmet, no shades, just presence. Colonel Samuel Adams, tall, broad-shouldered, steady. His uniform clean but not pristine. Sleeves rolled just enough to reveal a faded tattoo of a hawk on one arm. Eyes that scanned the street like they were still in enemy territory. He walked straight toward the bench. Frank looked up, blinked once, nodded. Sam didn't salute. He knelt. "Dad," he said quietly, brushing a knuckle against Frank's bruised cheek. "I got here as fast as I could." Frank didn't answer. Didn't need to. Behind Sam, the unit fanned out, forming a quiet half-circle. People watched from windows. One man dropped his phone. A waitress gasped. The biker froze, beer halfway to his lips. The patch on Sam's shoulder caught his eye. U.S. Army Special Operations. "Shh," he muttered. The unit didn't draw weapons. They didn't need to. Sam stood, took 1 step forward. "Which one of you struck a veteran?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Nobody spoke. Then Kyle, chest puffed with fading bravado, raised both hands slightly. "He bumped my bike, man. Sam's tone didn't change. "That man served while you were still figuring out how to spell your own name." Kyle scoffed. "You Army guys think you can just—" Sam took 1 more step. And that was enough. "I didn't come to threaten you," he said. "I came because my father bled on a sidewalk while cowards laughed." He turned, lifted 1 hand toward a soldier. The man nodded and tapped his comm. 2 minutes later, a cruiser rolled in. No sirens, just authority. The cuffs were cold. Kyle didn't resist. As they walked him to the car, his cocky grin washed away like chalk in rain. The street stayed still. Inside the Rusty Crow, music stopped. Someone shut the blinds. Frank remained seated, bag on lap, cane against his knee. Sam returned to him. "You okay?" he asked. Frank tilted his head slightly. "I've had worse," he said, "but not in front of so many doing nothing." That line stayed in the air like smoke. Then, from the crowd, a woman with graying hair stepped forward. I should have said something," she whispered. "I'm sorry." She handed Frank a clean handkerchief. He took it gently. From across the street, a boy removed his baseball cap. A retired sailor stood at attention. A kid no older than 10 saluted, hand shaky but proud. Something shifted. Phones lowered, people stood straighter, Because it wasn't about spectacle, it was about respect. And as Sam stood beside his father, looking across a town that had almost stayed silent, Frank finally spoke again. "Tell Tyler," he said, "don't ever take off that name patch, even when no one's looking." Sam nodded. "Yes, sir." And in that moment, the wind picked up just enough to lift the torn edge of the brown paper bag resting in Frank's lap. Inside it, one broken loaf of bread, still whole in meaning. If you've ever watched someone be ignored when they deserve to be honored, drop a 1 in the comments. Sometimes, one moment changes everything. A ripple of silence expanded across Main Street like a wave in a shallow pond, starting from the bench where Frank sat, outward toward sidewalks where strangers were frozen halfway through judgment. The bread had stopped rolling, the street had stopped moving, but something else had started. A low, dull hum. Faint at first, more a feeling than a sound, a vibration in the soles of the feet, a pressure behind the teeth. Then came the shift in the air, the strange, pressurized pull that made flags flutter against poles and loose awnings whip. People looked around. No one said anything yet, but they all heard it. Every dog within earshot began barking. Frank's hand rested on the cane beside him. He didn't look scared, not startled, not smug, just steady. The buzz of the hearing aid in his right ear mixed with the beat in the sky. One eye blinked slowly, not in reaction, but in recognition. It had begun. The biker, still leaning against his machine, took a long drag from his cigarette. The grin hadn't left his face completely, but it twitched now, edges fraying. Someone from inside the Rusty Crow muttered, "What is that?" A man in his 30s with a baseball cap pulled low, stepped out, looked to the tree line north of town, and froze. "Dude, that ain't no delivery drone." It wasn't. The Black Hawk UH-60 came into view low and fast, slicing through the winter sky like a steel arrow. It banked hard over the municipal water tower, descending so quickly the rotor wash sent trash bins tumbling and napkins spinning down the street. Phones were out now, cameras shaking in trembling hands. No one dared speak above the sound. Dust lifted from the abandoned baseball field behind the hardware store. The chopper hovered for a second, just long enough to make the town hold its breath, then dropped with force-moderated precision. Skids kissed the dirt with practiced grace. From its belly, 2 soldiers in tactical black emerged first, gear tight, movement fluid. No unnecessary motion, just efficiency built from 1,000 hours of rehearsals. Boots thudded in rhythm against the frozen ground. Then the SUV arrived. No lights, no sirens, just quiet authority. A matte black Chevy Suburban with federal plates screeched to a stop in front of the tavern. 4 men exited in unison, fanning out in formation. Submachine rifles remained holstered, but the body armor spoke for itself. Tier 1 Special Tactics Unit, likely Joint Special Operations Command. Frank didn't move. He knew the tempo. Inside the bar, someone whispered, "Are we under attack?" No. The opposite. From the chopper, a figure stepped down last. Not the fastest, not the flashiest, but the one everyone noticed first. Colonel Samuel Adams. His boots barely left impressions in the ground, yet every eye followed him. Mid-50s, salt in his hair but steel in his frame, Sam moved like a man who didn't walk unless every step mattered. He wasn't in full dress, but everything from the patch on his left shoulder, U.S. Army Special Operations, Command, Fort Bragg, to the hardened knuckles of his tactical gloves, screamed, "Not someone to test." His eyes locked on Frank across the street. Frank's face, still red from the earlier hit, lifted calmly. No smile, just a nod. Sam didn't salute. He knelt. Right there on Main Street, one knee in gravel, one gloved hand brushing gently against the bruise on his father's cheek. "I got here as fast as I could," Sam said. The biker, who moments ago had been sipping beer and bragging about knocking an old man over, now stood stock still. The bottle in his hand trembled slightly, because he saw it now. On the patch. Not police, not National Guard. Special Forces commander. And the man he hit wasn't just some retired nobody in a jacket too big for his shoulders. That man had a call sign, had a command, had a response protocol that could mobilize military precision within 14 minutes. Which one of you struck a veteran? Sam's voice wasn't loud, but it rang. The bar door creaked open. Nobody stepped out. The biker raised both hands half-heartedly. Hey, look, man, it's not like that. He bumped into my bike. Sam blinked once. You mean the man with the limp and the spine realignment surgery from a roadside bomb in Kabul? That man bumped your parked motorcycle? The biker stammered, eyes darting to the others. You got a badge? He challenged weakly. I don't need a badge, Sam said. I have blood on the sidewalk and a transmission log filed under Federal Code 46A. Assault on a military retiree in public jurisdiction. Want me to explain what that means to a judge? The biker said nothing. Frank, still sitting quietly, watched not just his son, but the town. People had started to emerge. A waitress from the coffee shop walked out, apron still on, mouth open. A boy on a scooter dropped it to the ground. A teenage girl pulled her earbuds free. Sam looked toward one of his men and gave a simple hand signal. Palm open, thumb folded. Silent instruction. The soldier stepped back, spoke into his comms. Exactly 2 minutes later, a local sheriff cruiser turned the corner. No sirens, just gravity. The two officers inside wore the look of men who'd been briefed. They didn't ask questions. They didn't assess the scene. They looked at Sam. He nodded. They walked up to the biker. Sir, turn around, one officer said, voice neutral. For what? The biker blurted. Assault on a decorated federal veteran under the Veteran Protection Act, provisioned under Penal Code 46A. You're under arrest. Frank heard it. The phrase rang in his ears like bells from a long-forgotten ceremony. Veteran Protection Act, he whispered. The biker didn't resist. His swagger dissolved the moment the cuffs clicked. And just like that, respect re-entered the room. As the cruiser pulled away, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something that hadn't lived here in a long time. Accountability. Sam returned to the bench, sat beside his father. You didn't tell them who you were? Frank smiled faintly. They didn't ask. From the crowd, a middle-aged man stepped forward, eyes red. Sir, I was inside. I saw what happened. I froze. I'm sorry. Frank nodded. Freezing's a reflex, he said. Staying frozen is a decision. The man looked down. Another voice. Can we do something? Sam turned to them. You already are. One by one, people stepped forward. A waitress brought out warm tea in a styrofoam cup. An elderly woman knelt beside Frank. Thank you for your service, she said. A boy, no more than 9, stood at full attention and saluted. Frank finally stood. He reached into his coat and pulled out the postcard, the one for his grandson. Let this make it there, he said to Sam, handing it over. He should know. He will. And then Frank looked at the biker's friends, still lingering outside the bar, unsure what to do, still drinking. You're not bad men, Frank said. You're just untrained. You think force is power. It isn't. What is, then? One muttered. Stillness, knowing when to stand and when not to swing. Sam stood taller. Frank leaned into his cane and took one long, deliberate breath. Above them, the Black Hawk waited. A soldier approached. Colonel, ready for exfil. Sam nodded. Frank shook his head. Not yet. Sam smiled. No, sir. Not until you say. As father and son stood there, side by side, 2 lifetimes apart in age but not in duty, the crowd watched. Not because they were told to, but because they finally saw. If you believe respect shouldn't need an audience to matter, type 2 in the comments. The moment the cuffs clicked, the town finally exhaled. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, there was no applause. But something in the atmosphere cracked, like a brittle wall around everyone's ribs finally gave way. What filled the space was not just silence, but accountability, thick and unmistakable. Kyle Rudd didn't say a word as the officers led him away. His boots scraped against the concrete like shame being dragged behind him. His leather vest, once a badge of ego, now looked too tight, too heavy. The man who'd laughed minutes ago was shrinking with every step. No one blocked the officer's path. No one defended him. Not his friends. Not the bartender. Not even the man with the "Don't Tread on Me" patch who used to shout over jukebox songs about freedom. They all just watched. Some with arms folded, some with eyes down, some trying to pretend they hadn't seen a thing. Commander Samuel Adams turned back toward the bench. Frank was still there, his hand resting on the cane, his back slightly hunched, not out of weakness, but habit. Like a man used to carrying things too heavy for others to notice. Bruises had darkened beneath his right eye. His lip was still cracked. The paper bag sat beside him, half torn, the cough drops long gone, the bread now flattened from its fall. But Frank didn't look broken. He looked anchored. "Dad," Sam said, crouching again, lowering his voice. "Are you all right?" Frank didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the sidewalks, the windows, the bodies half hiding behind hedges and car doors. "I'm not the one you should be asking," he finally said. Sam followed his gaze. The people of Whitlock were beginning to reappear, like ghosts slowly stepping back into their former shapes. A waitress clutching a coffee pot, a mechanic wiping grease from his hands, a mother clutching her daughter's shoulder just a little too tightly. Frank didn't raise his voice, but his words rang clear. They saw a man get struck and said nothing. Then they saw a Black Hawk land and found their courage again. He paused, not bitter, just observant. That says more than it should. A young man in a Carhartt jacket took a step forward from the curb. He looked barely 25. Probably grew up hearing stories about wars he'd never had to fight. "I'm sorry, sir," the kid said, swallowing. "I should have stepped in." Frank nodded. "Next time, do." The crowd didn't breathe. Another man stepped forward. Older, retired carpenter, worn flannel, trembling fingers. "I served in Nam," he said. "But I didn't recognize you. I didn't realize who you were." Frank looked at him, his face unreadable. "I'm no one special," he said. "Just someone who served. Like you." The man bowed his head. Still, what happened shouldn't have. Sam stood and turned to the gathering crowd. His voice carried now, not through volume, but precision. "This isn't about rank or uniform," he said. "This is about a line we crossed when we decided some people were too old to matter." No one moved. "And that line," he added, "doesn't exist in my unit. It won't exist in this town anymore either." Frank pushed himself up from the bench with effort. His knees cracked like tired hinges. The cane trembled in his grip, but his spine remained straight. From behind the diner window, a gray-haired woman stepped out with a first aid kit. She offered it without speaking. Frank took it with a soft, "Thank you." "You need a medic?" Sam asked. "I've had worse," Frank muttered again, but softer this time. He dabbed his lip with an alcohol pad, wincing just a little. Then he pulled out the postcard again, folded, unsent. "Tyler needs to hear about this," Frank said. "Not the violence, the choice afterward." Sam took it gently, sliding it into his jacket pocket. "I'll deliver it." A few feet away, a boy, 10, maybe 11, stood like a soldier, shoulders back, chin up. He didn't even flinch when his father touched his shoulder. Frank noticed. "Name?" he asked the father. "Jacob." Frank looked down at the boy. "Jacob, don't forget this. Not the Black Hawk. Not the arrest, but that you stood still and watched. What you do with that is what defines you. Jacob blinked, then gave a clumsy but heartfelt salute. Frank returned it. Then something remarkable began to happen. One by one, others joined. An older man with a Navy cap stepped forward. Then another in an Air Force jacket. Then a woman in a VA volunteer pin. They formed a line, not rigid, not rehearsed, but real. Veterans, children, shop owners, a barista, even a delivery driver still holding a lukewarm pizza box. They didn't chant. They didn't kneel. They stood. For Frank, for what had been lost in the noise. A phone buzzed, then another. Word was spreading. Local alerts, Twitter clips, geo-tagged TikTok videos with grainy shots of the Black Hawk descending behind Whitlock Elementary. Within 20 minutes, hashtags were trending. Respect, the elder, Frank Adams, never again, silence. Some called it a symbolic reckoning. Others said it was just one arrest, but the footage said more than headlines could. No dramatic edits, no background music. Just a frame of an old man, a soldier, gripping a bag of bread and staring back at a town that had finally remembered how to look. A news van from Toledo rolled in by hour's end. Sam stepped aside as reporters jumped from the sliding doors, mic ready and breathless. "We don't want to make this a circus," he warned. The mayor showed up next. Wrinkled tie, confused face. I just got the call. Is everything—" Sam walked straight toward him. "You missed it." The mayor blinked. "Missed what?" "The moment leadership was needed," Sam replied. "But maybe you can catch the next one." The mayor tried to smile, failed. Frank had returned to the bench, not to sit, but to gather the remains of his torn bag. One reporter knelt beside him. "Sir, could we get your thoughts?" Frank stared at her for a moment, then gently said, "Tell your camera I don't do interviews. I write letters." She nodded, unsure whether to smile. A crowd had now formed across the lot. Tourists, locals, some just filming. Frank faced them, not angry, not heroic, just present. "You don't owe me anything," he said, "but you owe yourself this. If you see something wrong and you wait to act until the right people arrive, then maybe you were supposed to be the right people." No one clapped, but someone wept. Later that afternoon, back inside the Black Hawk, Sam received a ping on his secured device, a notification tagged B32, Civilian Military Interface Response Log activated. He tapped it once, read the encrypted summary. A protocol had been triggered, non-lethal civilian rescue response, marked by an algorithm that detects suppressed public violence against decorated veterans. Apparently, his father's call had automatically registered on a database cross-linked with DoD ethics labs. He looked at the timestamp. 9:04 a.m. His father had activated it with a single key press. Frank had never needed to raise his voice. Because the infrastructure had been built around men like him, quiet, battered, steady, and all it needed was one press. Sam closed the report and glanced out the chopper window. The crowd below was still gathered. Frank remained at the edge of it, speaking to a teenager. They weren't filming, just talking. And that meant, more than anything, broadcasted. Later that evening, Kyle Rudd sat in a holding cell. No bail request, no lawyer yet. Just silence. He looked down at the scuffs on his boots. One lace had snapped. His knuckles were red, not from combat, but gripping a bench in a cold room for too long. A slip of paper slid under the glass slot in the door. It was stamped, Docket 46A, Veteran Assault Charge pending federal review. Court date, pending. But beneath it, handwritten in ink, were 3 unexpected words. He stood still. Kyle stared at the words for a long time. Long enough for regret to settle into his bloodstream like something chemical. He closed his eyes. Outside, the world was watching. But inside that room, inside that town, something much heavier had finally moved. If you've ever stood too long in silence, or found your voice just 1 second too late, drop a number 3 in the comments. Let's keep this moment from fading. The video didn't need music. It was louder without it. There were no slow-motion edits, no tear-jerker piano tracks swelling under voiceovers. Just the raw audio of wind hitting a microphone, boots thudding into dirt, and a dozen heartbeats holding still on a Thursday morning. It opened with a cane falling, a bag tearing, a loaf of bread spinning under a parked motorcycle. Then the silence, then the slap, then the helicopter. From upload to viral took 19 minutes. The original clip came from a teenager named Darnell Reyes, who'd been live streaming his breakfast burrito review from across the street when it all unfolded. The video started as shaky commentary about overpriced guacamole and turned mid-sentence into, "Yo, what the hell? What is that?" By the time the Blackhawks rotors kicked up dirt behind Rusty Crow Tavern, Darnell's stream had jumped from 12 viewers to over 9,000. Someone clipped the segment and threw it on Twitter with a caption, "Veteran knocked to the ground. Nobody helped. Until this happened." Hashtag, he stood still. That post alone hit 3 million views by lunch. By dusk, it was trending in 5 countries. By dawn, it was global. No filters, no captions, no edits. Just Frank, holding his torn bag, and a son kneeling at his side in full tactical gear. The moment hit the national cycle within hours. Local news picked it up first. Channel 9 WTOL. Their headline read, "Blackhawk Touchdown in Small Town Sparks Nationwide Veteran Awareness Campaign." They tried to track down Frank Adams for comment, but found only a polite handwritten note taped to his door. "No thank you. My story's already out there." Instead, the narrative was filled by others. Eyewitnesses, veterans, civic leaders, and, eventually, celebrities. A well-known podcast host opened his next episode with, "That man didn't fall. He absorbed our indifference." A senator retweeted the video with the caption, "This is why we need stronger protections under Federal Veteran Code 46A." A popular streamer donated $50,000 to a veteran mental health org and named it the Frank Fund. And while all this buzz stormed across social feeds and satellite signals, Frank was back at Ray's Deli, buying another loaf of bread and a fresh pack of cough drops. "Didn't expect to be famous for falling," he said to the cashier, who only blinked in response. At the Department of Defense, an ethics liaison within the Civilian Military Behavioral Monitoring Program, CMBMP, opened the surveillance flag logged from Whitlock at 09:04 a.m. incident. Tag B32, triggered, code word Eagle 6. Response, latency, 13.6 minutes. Category, public abuse of decorated veteran. Subsection, passive bystander failure. Legal tie-in, 46A, 1127. B, neglect of distress. Signals in municipal civil zones. A red note was added. Response met conditions for discretionary review. Recommend further field simulation logging. In plain English, Frank had tripped a sensor hidden in the nation's moral subconscious, and the response wasn't algorithmic. It was organic, real. A town stopped, a nation leaned in, a generation woke up. That night, in a family room 5 states away, a high school sophomore named Kayla Benton watched the video 3 times in a row. Her father, retired Master Sergeant, had died of a heart attack while delivering groceries to a shelter no one remembered. She hadn't spoken about it in 2 years. Now, she was writing about it in a journal titled, "The Day a Quiet Man Made Noise." She would read that essay at her graduation ceremony 1 year later. Across the country, in a VA clinic in Austin, a counselor paused between sessions to show the clip to a struggling combat vet. "He didn't hit back," the vet said quietly. "But he didn't fall alone." The counselor nodded. "And you don't have to either." At 10:36 a.m. EST the next day, the White House press secretary was asked directly about the video. "Has the administration seen the footage?" "Yes." Thoughts on the military response? The footage speaks for itself. And the town's reaction. She paused. America saw its reflection. Some liked it, some didn't. Meanwhile, Kyle Rudd, still in holding, was finally allowed to make a call. It wasn't to a lawyer, it was to his mother. "Mom?" His voice cracked through the speaker. "It was just a reflex. I didn't know who he was." There was silence on the line. Then, "You didn't have to know who he was to know he was someone." She hung up. The guard didn't comment. Kyle sat there, elbows on knees, staring at the blank wall. The paper still sat on the bench beside him. Docket 46A, pending federal referral. He folded it neatly, then not so neatly, then again, trying to make it disappear. Back in Whitlock, someone had taped a copy of the video still. Frame 03.17, Frank kneeling, bag in hand, to the window of the Rusty Crow. By lunchtime, it had been covered in Sharpie messages. "I saw you. I'm sorry. You deserved better. I will never stay silent again." He didn't flinch. Later that night, the bar issued a short public statement on its Facebook page. "We regret the incident that occurred outside our establishment. It does not reflect the values we stand for. We are cooperating fully with the investigation." The post received over 11,000 comments. Only 37 were positive. Someone had reposted the video with new text. The town laughed, but the town also watched. It reached 8.7 million views within 24 hours. Inside Frank's home, modest, quiet, untouched by the frenzy, he sat at a desk sorting old letters. The kind soldiers send and rarely receive. Sam had offered to come over. Frank declined. "I've already had enough attention for 5 lifetimes," he said. Instead, he slipped on his reading glasses, pulled out a letter labeled 1972, John from Da Nang, and began reading in silence. The world was moving faster now, but Frank stayed steady. When asked by a young reporter later that week if he had a message for the millions watching him, he paused and said, "I didn't ask to be filmed, but maybe the country needed to see something without special effects." The mayor of Whitlock, after initially bumbling through press questions, finally contacted Sam Adams. "We'd like to hold a community event, something to show our gratitude." "Gratitude for what?" "For your father, for the message, for the wake-up call." Sam considered. "Make it about him, not the press." "It will be." "Then he might show up." A week later, on a school playground in Wisconsin, a 4th grader tied an American flag to her bicycle. When asked why, she said, "Because a man fell and got back up." Across that weekend, countless reaction videos, think pieces, and panel discussions dissected the clip. Media outlets assigned it names: the cane and the copter, bread and backbone, stillness as protest. But what people remembered was simpler: the look on Frank's face, the silence after the slap, the stillness before the sky broke open. In the office of a military think tank in Arlington, a Pentagon analyst drafted a case brief: Use of Passive Defense Presence, PDP, in Urban Morale Restoration. Case study: Operation Eagle Response, Whitlock. It outlined strategic potential in low-violence tactical appearances, citing measurable shifts in civilian behavioral compliance after exposure to elite unit presence, without escalation. It was forwarded to Lab B32, tagged for ethical review. Somewhere in between trending hashtags and late-night monologues, the video began doing what no viral content ever promises. It began changing people, not just online, but in driveways, coffee lines, bus stops. Veterans got called by old friends, sons apologized to fathers, daughters asked questions they'd never dared to before. Frank never changed his routine. Still walked to Ray's every Thursday. Still bought the same loaf. Still wore the same jacket. But now, someone always opened the door first. Someone always greeted him by name. And sometimes, just before the door shut behind him, someone would say, "Thank you." Not loudly, just enough. If you believe the truth doesn't need music, only eyes that are finally open, type number 4 in the comments. They renamed the field not to honor a war, but a man. At first, the proposal seemed too quick, too performative. It came during a city council meeting that was unusually crowded for a Tuesday night. There were new faces, some wearing military pins, some still in uniform, others just quiet with hands folded in their laps. A motion was introduced to designate the city's Southside Municipal Park as Briggs Field in honor of Sergeant Franklin Adams, United States Army, retired. There was hesitation, not from disagreement, but the kind of hesitation born of guilt. Guilt has a sound in a town meeting. It's in the way papers shuffle when no one's reading. It's in the way people clear their throats just to fill the silence. It's in how the mayor said, "Do we have a second?" even though he already knew the answer. They all raised their hands. Unanimous. The preparations began the next morning. Not just a plaque, but a full rededication. Folding chairs, flags, a platform constructed by local volunteers. The middle school chorus would sing the national anthem, and the veterans' motorcycle group offered to form an escort. The American Legion provided a color guard, but one thing wasn't certain. Would Frank show up? He hadn't answered anyone directly, not the mayor, not the reporter from the Columbus Dispatch, not even his son. Sam Adams had dropped by the house twice since the viral explosion. Each time, Frank had listened, nodded, and then gone back to tending the small raised garden in his backyard, half herbs, half memories. "You coming, Dad?" Sam asked gently. Frank rubbed soil from his fingers. "If it's for me, probably not." "It is." "Then maybe it shouldn't be." But the morning of the event, just after 9 a.m., a silver Ford Explorer pulled into the driveway. The passenger side door opened first. Out stepped Sam, dress blues pristine, medals gleaming, but his face as tense as if he were back in Kandahar. He walked around, opened the other door, and Frank Adams emerged. Not walking, not stubborn, just accepting. He allowed Sam to push the wheelchair down the ramp, his hand resting lightly on the armrest. Not gripping, not resisting. Just there. The crowd at Briggs Field rose as one. No rehearsal, no signal, they just stood. Some placed hands over hearts, others held hats to chests. A boy near the front saluted too early, too eagerly, but Frank noticed and gave him a wink. The ceremony began with a few words from the mayor. His speech was safe, a little stilted, clearly written by someone else. He stumbled when saying Franklin instead of Francis, and Sam gave him a side glance sharp enough to shave paint off a podium. But what followed redeemed it all. From behind the curtain, 42 middle school students stepped forward in matching red polos. Their teacher gave a discreet nod, and the group began. "Oh, say, can you see?" The notes weren't perfect. A few voices cracked. But something about their nervous sincerity made the anthem feel new again. Frank's eyes didn't water, but they softened. Just slightly. When the chorus finished, a different kind of silence fell, heavier. Like the earth was holding its breath. Then Sam stepped up. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he turned to look at his father. Really look. "Most people know my father now because of a video," Sam began. "But what I know of him doesn't fit inside a clip, or a caption, or a trending hashtag." The wind rustled through the flagpoles beside the platform. "He taught me how to shoot a rifle, how to keep my boots clean, how to fold a map by memory. But he also taught me when not to speak, when to let silence do the heavy lifting." A few nods in the crowd. "When I was stationed overseas, I read his letters like scripture. Short, steady, dry humor, usually ending with, 'Keep your feet warm, idiot.'" A ripple of laughter broke the tension. "And on the day he called me, the day he pressed one single button on a flip phone older than some of you in the back, he didn't tell me what happened. He didn't scream. He just said, 'Eagle 6, bench on Maine.' That's all." Sam's jaw tightened. "And I came." He turned toward the crowd. And now, you all came too. He looked at the plaque behind him. Bronze, heavy, new. It read, "In honor of Sergeant Franklin Adams, U.S. Army mechanic, Gulf War and Kosovo, a quiet shield between us and chaos. He stood still." When Sam stepped down, he didn't return to the mic. He returned to the chair. He knelt again, this time without a helmet, without command, without audience. "Thanks, Dad." Frank reached out, not to pat, not to perform, just to connect. A hand on his son's shoulder, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. After the ceremony, Frank didn't leave immediately. He sat beneath the oak tree near the edge of the field. People came in waves. Some approached, some didn't. A woman in her 30s knelt beside him, offering nothing but her presence. A teenager asked if he could take a photo, not for social media, but to show my little brother what courage looks like. A man in a Department of Veterans Affairs windbreaker handed Frank a sealed envelope. Inside, a personal letter of commendation from the Secretary of Defense. Stamped, Program B-32, Civilian Heroic Restraint Review. Sam opened it beside him. "This is new," he murmured. "B-32?" Frank asked. Sam nodded. "Experimental ethics oversight tied to behavioral response simulations. They're watching towns now, not just soldiers." Frank snorted. "That's either smart or terrifying. Maybe both." As the crowd thinned, someone began folding the chairs, but one boy stayed behind. He stood at attention near the plaque, lips moving, whispering maybe, practicing. Frank waved him over. "Got something to say?" he asked. The boy nodded. "My grandpa served. He never talked about it. I think he wanted to, but nobody asked." Frank looked at the boy's shoes, muddy, unlaced, honest. "Then, maybe you should be the one to start the conversation." The boy's eyes widened. "With who?" "Whoever's left to listen." That night, Frank returned home to find a small package on his porch. No return label. Inside, a pocket-sized sketchbook filled front to back with pencil drawings. Scenes from the video. The bench. The bread. The soldier kneeling. The hand on the cheek. On the final page, a message. "You taught me what presence means. K.R." Sam visited late. They sat on the porch, warm drinks in hand, moonlight dancing on the railing. "Today meant something," Sam said. Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah, but tomorrow will mean more, because they'll either remember it or forget it." "And what if they forget?" Frank looked at the flag in the yard, half lit, still. "Then we remind them." And just before midnight, the wind picked up across Briggs Field. One lone folding chair, forgotten on the edge of the platform, finally gave way to gravity, tipping backward into the soft earth. Its fall made no sound. But if you'd been there, really been there, you might have sworn you heard a voice on the breeze say, "He never asked to be seen, but now no one can look away." If you've ever waited too long to say thank you, or wish you still could, leave a number 5 in the comments. Because honor, once spoken, echoes longer than silence ever could. The letter had no return address, but it had weight. It came wrapped in quiet, like everything else that seemed to arrive in Frank's life these days. Not the thunder of choppers, not the snap of military protocol. Just a white envelope, creased at the corners, slightly smudged, resting on the kitchen table like it had walked in on its own. Frank almost didn't open it. He had gotten used to mail he didn't ask for, honors, campaign ribbons reissued for PR, cards from strangers who meant well but wrote like they were addressing a statue. But this one was different. The paper was cheap, ink slightly runny, the handwriting shaky, like someone hadn't held a pen in a long time or maybe had too much to say and no idea how to say it. 6 words. That's all it took to bring the past walking back in. "If you'll meet me, I'll listen. No signature, no apology, no demand. Just that sentence." And Frank knew. He didn't tell Sam, not right away. Instead, he walked, cane in hand, boots worn, Around the neighborhood 3 full times. Same loop, same sidewalk, same squirrels pretending to be guardians of the lawn. By the 4th loop, the decision was made. Because something in the phrasing wasn't defensive, it wasn't even redemptive. It was open, raw. He recognized that tone. He'd heard it in the voice of a private once, years ago, in the back of a military triage tent, bleeding from his side, crying not because of pain, but because he had lived. "Why me, Sarge?" the kid had whispered. And Frank had answered without blinking, "Because you're not done yet." The courthouse conference room was small, windowless, stale with the scent of fluorescent lighting and decades of dust woven into the carpet. No one else was scheduled, no press, no guards inside, just a single table, 2 chairs, and the thick silence between them. Kyle Rudd sat hunched over, elbows on knees, hands knotted like he was gripping the edge of his past and afraid it might tip over. He didn't look up when Frank entered, didn't stand, didn't speak, just breathed in small, fractured pieces. Frank didn't rush. He didn't settle into the chair like someone forgiving. He sat like someone weighing a moment, someone deciding whether this silence deserved to end. Then, quietly, he said, "I almost didn't come." Kyle nodded, still staring at the floor. "But I remembered something," Frank added. "A man I served with. He came back broken. Broke his family, too. Nearly broke a stranger in a parking lot once. I met him years later, cleaned up, volunteering at a shelter. He said, 'Time doesn't fix people, but sometimes silence gives them room to start over.'" That was the first time Kyle looked up. His eyes weren't defensive anymore. They were scared. "My dad was Army," he said, voice hoarse. "Vietnam. Came back with nothing in his eyes. He never hit me. But he never hugged me either. You know? Just ghosted the whole damn house for 20 years. Frank said nothing. Kyle continued. "I thought I hated soldiers. All that pride, that silence, that jacket." His jaw tightened. "But I think I just hated not understanding what it did to him." Frank leaned back slightly. "You don't have to understand everything," he said. "But you don't get to strike at it just because it scares you." Kyle nodded. Slowly. The words hit, not like bullets, but like truth being set gently in front of him, and letting him decide if he'd pick it up. He reached into his coat pocket and slid a folded document across the table. "I know it doesn't mean anything yet, but I signed up." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Volunteer driver program. VA shuttles. Twice a week. Court ordered?" "No. I mean, I got a directive under 46A restitution options, but this wasn't on the list. I asked for it." Frank unfolded the paper. VA volunteer intake form. Signature shaky but real. He looked up. "Why?" Kyle shrugged. "Because I don't want to be remembered as the guy who hit a veteran and ended up on YouTube. I don't know. I want someone to say, 'That's Kyle. He shows up.'" Frank folded the paper again. "You won't earn it fast," he said. "But every day you show up, you get closer." Kyle wiped his eyes, though he didn't seem to notice the tears. They just fell. That meeting didn't make headlines. No one recorded it. No viral moment. No applause. But it changed 2 men, and that was enough. 6 days later, Frank sat alone on the bench at Briggs Field. It had rained the night before. The air smelled of clean earth and old grass. He watched as children chased each other between the folding chairs that hadn't been packed up yet. No one recognized him today, and he was okay with that. Then he heard it. Not a Black Hawk, not boots, just a van door sliding open, and a voice, low but sure. "Need help getting to the appointment, sir?" Frank turned. It was Kyle. Different clothes. Plain jeans, brushed hair, VA ID on a lanyard. Frank didn't smile, but he nodded, and that was enough. Across the state, a social worker at the Department of Veterans Affairs filled out a digital record under Program B32. She marked a note. Subject KR 2025, Incident 46A, showed sustained voluntary behavioral correction. No further incident. Recommended. Upgrade from yellow tag to conditional green. Below that was a single line in italics. Remorse must be measurable, not loud. Frank never talked about the meeting to anyone. But Sam noticed. He noticed his father walked a little straighter that week, that his usual cup of coffee lasted longer, that he paused a little longer when tying his boots, not from age, but from thought. "You good, Dad?" he asked on the porch one morning. Frank sipped. "Not good. Just lighter." And Sam understood. Meanwhile, back in that same courthouse, another letter sat waiting in a clerk's bin. This time, it was from Frank, addressed to the judge. Inside, a single statement. "I request leniency in the sentencing of Kyle Rudd. If every action speaks, so should the next one." It was stamped, filed, recorded, and it changed the tone of the hearing that followed. At the sentencing, Kyle stood straight. No excuses, no speech. When asked if he had anything to say, he simply said, "I was wrong." And Frank, seated in the back row, nodded. He didn't rise, didn't speak. But when the judge handed down probation, community service, and mandatory counseling under 46A Remediation Pathway B, there was no public outcry. Because people had watched this redemption unfold, not in courts, but in sidewalks, buses, and quiet Thursday mornings. That evening, Kyle parked the VA van in the lot behind Briggs Field. He helped an elderly man out, handed him his walker, and waited for his wife to catch up. "You're the guy from the clip, right?" she asked. Kyle hesitated. "I'm the guy after the clip." The woman smiled. "That's the one people remember." Across the field, Frank watched it happen. He didn't wave, but he tapped his cane twice against the bench wood. A sound only two people understood. And in that moment, not a word was spoken. But something louder passed between them. Forgiveness doesn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it just drives up, opens the door, and waits quietly while you climb in. If you believe people can change, even after the damage, drop a number 6 in the comments. One moment can still rewrite the story. He wore no uniform, but his actions fit like one. At first, no one noticed him at the VA clinic. He arrived early, left late, stayed out of the break room, and never spoke unless necessary. But the staff learned his rhythm quickly, how he lined up the wheelchairs every morning before anyone else arrived, how he always had tissues in his pocket, how he learned to listen in the pauses between breath and memory. Kyle Rudd was rebuilding himself, not with a hammer, but with presence. He didn't tell people why he was there. He didn't mention the video, didn't correct those who thought he was just another part-time volunteer trying to build credit for a future college app. Let them believe it. He wasn't interested in erasing what he'd done. He was trying to earn the chance for the next thing he did to matter more. And quietly, steadily, it started to. On a Tuesday afternoon, a vet named Gerald came in cursing at the staff, his PTSD flaring after being stuck in traffic near fireworks. Kyle didn't flinch. He didn't bark back. He just stepped forward, lowered his voice, and said, "You want the side exit? No noise, no cameras. I'll walk with you." And he did. Gerald cried halfway through the parking lot, not because of trauma, because someone had walked beside him without judgment. That moment never made it to Twitter. But Frank heard about it, he always did. 3 weeks into Kyle's probation, the VA lead counselor submitted a B32 progress note. Subject shows measurable adaptive behavioral shifts. Pattern: high empathy, low volatility, self-initiated de-escalation. Recommendation: consider B32 green flag progression to mentorship clearance. The data entry clerk paused on that last phrase. Mentorship. It didn't mean supervision. It meant others might one day learn from him. One cold morning, Frank stepped into Ray's deli to get his usual bread, cough drops, postcard. The bell above the door jingled. And there was Kyle, behind the counter, wearing an apron. Ray was out sick. Kyle had offered to cover. He didn't say anything at first, just slid the coffee Frank liked, black, too hot, bitter, across the counter and nodded. Frank took it, sat, watched. A woman came in pushing her husband's wheelchair, trying to juggle the door, her purse, and a prescription bag. Kyle opened the door, steadied the chair, picked up the purse without asking. Then he walked away before thanks could land. Frank smiled to himself. Later that week, Sam met Kyle by accident. He was parked outside Briggs Field, waiting for his dad to finish a walk. Kyle was helping an older man from the shuttle, adjusting his seatbelt with the kind of care that made Sam pause. "You Rudd?" Sam asked from his truck. Kyle turned, nodded once. Sam didn't speak immediately. Then, "My dad believes in second chances. Doesn't mean I hand them out like candy." Kyle stepped forward, not aggressive, just direct. "Understood. You hit a man with a legacy longer than your life. I'm trying to build one of my own, quietly." Sam studied him. "You working with the VA now?" "Volunteer basis." "Court-directed?" "Court-approved, self-directed." Sam nodded. "You keep this up, I might stop wanting to punch you." Kyle smiled for the first time. Progress. At a town council meeting 2 days later, the mayor mentioned a proposal. "There's been a community push to create a transportation assistance program for disabled veterans. We're considering naming it the Shield Network." Frank, sitting in the back, didn't speak, but someone asked, "Who would run it?" No one expected the answer. "We've had interest from a current volunteer, Kyle Rudd." The room went quiet, not angry, just surprised. Then a retired Marine stood and said, "Sometimes you wear a uniform, sometimes you become one." A week later, Kyle was officially hired, minimum wage, city-funded, part-time status. But that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the look on the face of a wheelchair-bound Navy vet when Kyle rolled up beside him at 6:45 a.m. with coffee, gloves, and a bad joke ready. "You ever drive one of these?" the vet asked, eyeing the shuttle van. "Just enough to stay legal," Kyle replied. "Good enough." They didn't speak the rest of the ride. But when the man got out, he gripped Kyle's arm and said, "I don't know what you did before, but this fits." That afternoon, Frank and Sam sat watching from the bench near the flagpole. "Think he's changed?" Sam asked. Frank didn't answer right away. Then, "He's not trying to prove he's different, he's just acting like it." Sam nodded, and from across the field, Kyle lifted one hand in greeting. Frank raised his coffee cup in return. The next day, Kyle visited a high school class as part of a local outreach event. Not as a speaker, just to drive a vet who was presenting. But the teacher, recognizing him, asked if he'd like to say a few words. He hesitated, then stepped up, and said the one sentence that would later be written on the whiteboard and left there for a month. "You don't need a badge to make a difference, but you do need to show up." He didn't talk about the slap, didn't mention the video. But afterward, a kid waited near the door and asked quietly, "Was it you?" Kyle nodded. "I hit someone," the kid confessed. "At school, pushed a smaller kid. No one did anything." "What happened next?" Kyle asked. "Nothing. Just, it got quiet." Kyle crouched to his level. "Then it's still your move." At the next Briggs Field Memorial, Kyle stood among the volunteers in a plain white shirt, holding a folding chair in each hand. He didn't take the front row, but Frank saw him. Sam saw him. And when the ceremony ended, Frank walked over slowly and tapped his cane on the sidewalk once, an old soldier's code for "stand down." Kyle turned, nodded, and said nothing. But his eyes said everything. By now, local news had stopped covering him. The internet had long moved on. But the right people noticed. Frank received a small envelope in the mail 2 weeks later. Inside, a program flyer. The Department of Veterans Affairs is proud to announce the Rudd Pilot Program, Civilian Volunteer Integration for B-32 Flagged Communities. Below it, in bold, proof of change isn't measured in words, it's measured in presence. Frank pinned it to his fridge, next to a faded photo of his old army unit, next to the postcard to his grandson he never mailed, because by now, the kid already knew. And sometimes on Sunday mornings, Frank would pass by the diner window and see Kyle helping a vet with a walker to his booth. Not because he was being watched, but because he wasn't. And that's how Frank knew. If you've ever known someone who changed not by speaking louder but by showing up better, drop a number 7 in the comments, because redemption doesn't need a uniform, just a purpose. They sat on the same bench, but saw different wars. Frank's fingers curled loosely around the curve of his cane, tapping twice against the wooden slat beside him, once for rhythm, once for presence. Sam sat to his right, still in uniform, not because he had to be, but because the cloth gave him a center. They didn't look at each other. Sometimes the most honest conversations don't need faces, just space and silence. Frank broke it first. "You never asked me about Iraq." Sam kept his eyes forward. "Figured if you wanted to talk you would." "That's not how we were trained." "I know." Another pause. Then Frank added, "We saw smoke before we heard the blast. Sand kicked like thunder. We were under a tarp that barely held. Pulled 2 men out before the flames caught their ammo packs. One didn't make it. One lost both legs. I didn't get a scratch." Sam's jaw tightened. "That was the day I stopped praying," Frank said. "Because you were mad?" "Because I was confused." Sam nodded slowly, his fingers locked between his knees. "I prayed every day in Kandahar," he replied, then stopped when we lost Avery, 23, smart kid, got tagged by a heat sensor drone that mistook his shadow for a threat. AI lock, 50 cal, 10 seconds. Took us 2 hours to find all of him. Frank turned slightly, the lines in his face deepening like fault lines. "Machines firing at shadows." "Yeah, welcome to Warfare 5.0. The sun dipped lower, coating Briggs Field in gold like it was something sacred. Nearby, kids played flag football, their shouts bleeding into the background like white noise. 2 generations of war sat still while life moved around them. "I saw your report," Frank said. "The one B-32 flagged." Sam raised an eyebrow. "Thought that was sealed." "I still have friends." Of course he did. Frank continued. "They said you requested to deploy a mobile ethics drone during Operation Lone Palisade. Declined by the Oversight Board. They said it humanized enemy fire zones too much, slowed down target acquisition, got in the way of the efficiency matrix." Frank's voice lowered. "Translation: you cared too much." Sam gave a half smile. "Or I learned something from you." They sat in silence again. A man passed by with a dog. The leash was taut, but the dog paused just long enough to look at Frank, tail wagging like it knew. "You ever regret it?" Sam asked. "Which part?" "The wait, the silence. Wearing the uniform then. Not." Frank breathed through his nose long and slow. "I don't regret the service," he said. "I regret how much of myself I buried under it. When I came back, I was still operating like the mission wasn't over. I didn't know how to turn the volume down, so I turned everything else down instead." Sam nodded. "You turned me down too." Frank winced slightly. "I know." A bird landed on the edge of the bench, tilting its head like it was trying to understand. "You were gone, even when you were home," Sam said. "And you enlisted anyway." "Because I wanted to see what you saw." Frank looked at his son for the first time. "And did you?" Sam stared back. "I saw worse." The breeze picked up, rustling the trees overhead. Flags lining the field flapped like they were remembering something. "You ever read your citation for Kosovo?" Sam asked. Frank scoffed. "I lived it. Why read it?" "I have it, right here." Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper, creased like it had been opened too many times. He unfolded it, cleared his throat. "For extraordinary composure under siege, and for the recovery of 3 downed soldiers under chemical risk from an unsecured lab in Sector B. Frank raised an eyebrow. That was never supposed to be declassified. It wasn't, Sam said. But B-32 has access. That's the thing about those old ghost files. They always rise eventually. Frank looked at the field again. The kids had started packing up. The wind had turned colder. I didn't know what was in that lab, he said. They told us to extract the wounded. No one mentioned experimental synthesis compound leak. I couldn't breathe for 2 days after that. Thought I'd brought it home. To your mother. To you. Sam lowered the citation. You didn't. But I think the fear stayed longer than the gas ever would have. For a long time, they didn't speak. Then Frank leaned back, eyes half closed. You know the last time I cried? Sam waited. Your mom's funeral? No. It wasn't then. It was after. I dropped a coffee mug in the kitchen, broke it, and when I looked at the shards, I saw my hands shaking. I wasn't mourning her. I was mourning who I used to be around her. Sam's eyes glassed over. I still dream of her, he said. Frank looked up. She'd be proud of you. Sam smiled. She'd be furious I didn't starch my collar for the last ceremony. Frank chuckled. She used to iron my uniforms until I learned how to hide them. I figured out the same trick, Sam said. They both laughed, real, soft, long. The moment didn't last, because healing never holds steady. It arrives in pulses. Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out a small package wrapped in cloth. I've been holding on to this. He handed it to Sam. Inside was a watch, Army issue, Vietnam era, cracked but ticking. It was my father's, Frank said. Gave it to me after I made E5. Said, this will outlast the body. Don't let it outlast your mind. Sam fastened it around his wrist. The tick was faint, but present. Across the field, Kyle was helping an elderly woman into the shuttle. He glanced at the bench, caught Frank's nod, returned it. Sam watched. You think people can really change? Frank didn't hesitate. Only if they do it when no one's filming. Sam smiled. Then I think he's on his way. The sun hit the horizon. Orange bled into violet. Shadows stretched long. Frank tapped his cane once more against the bench, then said softly, I never told you I was proud. Sam turned. You didn't have to. But I should have. Sam nodded. Frank looked at him again. And I am. A pause. Then, not just for the uniform, for taking it off the right way. Sam didn't cry, but his breath caught just once, and Frank noticed. They sat there long after the field emptied. One man in a jacket that no longer fit the world, another in a uniform he'd one day outgrow. Neither needed words anymore, because for the first time in years they were wearing something rarer than medals. They were wearing peace. If you've ever had a conversation that took years to arrive, but changed everything in a moment, drop a number 8 in the comments. Some battles need no gunfire, just a bench, and the will to sit together. In the courtroom, no one raised their voice that day. No gavel slammed. No lawyers argued with theatrical cadence. No jury scribbled furiously. What filled the space instead was something more unsettling. Expectation. The kind of silence that sharpens every sound around it. The faint tick of the wall clock. The soft scrape of shoes on polished floor. The deliberate shuffle of a man trying not to look at anyone directly. Kyle Rudd stood next to his attorney at the defendant's table, dressed in slacks and a white button-down shirt. The leather vest was long gone. So was the arrogance. In its place, posture born of humility, not habit. His shoulders didn't slouch from fatigue. They held the burden of what he'd done. The room wasn't packed. There were a few familiar faces, VA representatives, a court liaison from B-32's Civilian Behavioral Unit, and, on the back row, barely visible behind a column of light spilling through the windows, Frank Adams. He sat like a man who had been here before. Because he had. The judge, a woman with gray streaks in her tightly wound hair and a face made for both kindness and control, cleared her throat and looked at the docket. Case Nabrar 24901, State versus Kyle Rudd, charged under Title 18, Section 46A of the Federal Veteran Protection Statute. She paused. A small reaction ran through the observer's bench. The 46A charge wasn't just a regular assault. It carried weight, a symbolic recognition that harming a decorated veteran wasn't just violence. It was cultural desecration. Kyle's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we waive our right to a full trial. My client accepts full responsibility and submits to sentencing. However, we would like to offer a statement from Mr. Rudd himself and enter into the record the B-32 remediation progress reports and community witness letters. The judge nodded. Proceed. Kyle stepped forward. He didn't bring notes. No one expected him to speak like a politician, but everyone watched him like a man carrying his own verdict before it was ever read. I don't know what I thought I was proving, he began. The day it happened, I was angry. At life, at my past, at every damn authority figure who ever walked past me and made me feel small. His voice didn't tremble. It cracked once, but never lost shape. And then I saw someone who looked like all of that. Authority. History. That jacket, that cane, the way he stood. It made me feel something I didn't know how to process. He looked at Frank then. Just once. He didn't provoke me. He didn't raise a hand. But I struck him anyway. Silence. No one coughed. No one shuffled. Even the bailiff seemed to pause mid-breath. And he could have destroyed me for that. He had every right to. But instead, he met me, in a quiet room, and told me something I haven't forgotten since. Kyle looked back at the judge. You won't earn it fast, but every day you show up, you get closer. A few heads nodded in the back. He took a breath. I've been showing up, at the VA, at town meetings, as a driver, as a set of hands when someone older than me needs help walking into a building. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I've learned that trying to be deserving isn't about asking for it. It's about being useful. He paused. I'm not asking for a reduced sentence. I'm asking for the chance to keep being useful. The judge leaned back, eyes narrow, considering. Then she turned to the gallery. I understand Mr. Adams is in attendance. Frank didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he stood. The cane made no sound against the carpeted floor. He walked forward, not with theatrical gravitas, but with the kind of deliberate presence that made people straighten without realizing they'd done it. The clerk handed him a mic. He didn't test it, didn't clear his throat. He just looked at Kyle and spoke. You did a coward's thing that day. Kyle dropped his gaze. But you've been walking like a man ever since. Eyes around the room flicked between them. I asked for leniency, Frank said. Not because he apologized, but because he stopped trying to. He started acting like someone who understands time doesn't rewind, only replays, and that if you don't change the next scene, you're just watching the same failure again and again. He faced the judge. You do what you have to. But if we start locking away everyone who acted out of pain, we'll run out of cells before we run out of men. And with that, Frank turned and walked back to his seat. No extra words, no flourish, just truth. Delivered clean and steady. The judge folded her hands. She looked at the DA's office. Any objection to alternative sentencing under the B-32 Civic Reparation Clause? The prosecutor, a man with more years than wrinkles, simply shook his head. No, Your Honor. The victim's voice here is louder than mine. Then I hereby suspend incarceration under Section 46A, she said. Mr. Rudd, you are sentenced to continue your service with the Department of Veterans Affairs for no less than 12 months under monitored review. You will report weekly to Officer Lane, maintain your driving assignments, and submit quarterly behavioral logs to the B-32 Civilian Military Ethics Board. She looked directly at him. You are not free. You are responsible. There's a difference. Kyle nodded. Understood. She added almost gently, Good. Let's keep it that way. Outside the courthouse, the sky had turned a pale gunmetal gray, typical of early November. Cold enough to see breath, still warm enough to leave a jacket unzipped. Frank stepped out first. Sam met him at the bottom of the stairs. You didn't have to say anything. I did. Why? Because the court wasn't the only one listening. Sam turned to see Kyle standing beside the shuttle van, loading a walker into the trunk for a patient waiting on the sidewalk. A small group had gathered around him. No cameras, just nods. He's making ripples, Sam said. No, Frank replied. He's keeping them from dying out. Later that evening, a newspaper editor from out of state called to ask Frank for a quote about the sentencing. Frank refused, but he mailed her something instead, a note on yellow legal paper with only one line. Justice isn't always loud, but mercy is never quiet. Back at the VA, Kyle sat in the break room between pickups, sipping lukewarm coffee, flipping through a logbook of service records. Not to skim, to study. He was starting to learn the names, the timelines, the invisible bruises behind each military ID number. Then he paused on one entry. Name: Franklin J. Adams. Rank: Sergeant, Rate. Deployment: Gulf War, Kosovo service type, Engineering plus. Hazardous recovery. Notes: Restraint classification. Class A, Ethical Priority Override approved by B-32. Kyle traced the last line with his thumb. Ethical Priority Override. He didn't know exactly what it meant, but it sounded like someone, somewhere, had chosen to see a man before they saw a mistake. When Frank returned home, there was a small envelope in the mailbox. Inside, a note from the judge. I've presided over 4,000 cases. I've passed sentence on 17 felony 46A charges. Yours was the first where silence spoke louder than law. Below it, a quote typed on the bottom edge. The man you forgive today might carry the next man tomorrow. That night, as rain began to fall in slow, even sheets, Kyle waited outside Briggs Field in the shuttle van for his last pickup of the day. Frank stepped in. They didn't speak, but as Kyle adjusted the radio, Frank murmured, "Don't play anything too loud." Kyle smiled. Got it. He switched the dial. What came through was a song with no lyrics, just quiet piano, and the sound of the road stretching in front of them. If you believe true justice starts when judgment ends, leave a number 9 in the comments. Because sometimes the loudest verdict is the one that leaves room for change. In the age of eyes everywhere, nothing truly disappears. The video may have gone viral, but it never truly left the algorithm. Even after the news cycle spun into new tragedies, new scandals, new faces, that one clip, Frank Adams, the slap, the bench, the Black Hawk, kept getting replayed. Quietly. Automatically. Embedded in think pieces, reaction videos, classroom discussions, training simulations, it lived in digital shadows, not always on the surface, but never gone. At a Department of Defense sub-agency, officially labeled B-32 Civic Military Behavior Analytics, unofficially called the Human Mirror Lab, an algorithm pinged with a priority flag. Tag: Incident Replay. Count: plumb 5 million, post-archive. Behavioral drift analysis. Inconclusive note. Possible resurgence in radicalized commentary clusters. A technician named Marla Jensen leaned back from her monitor. She adjusted her glasses and muttered, "It's resurfacing again." Beside her, a junior analyst scrolled through an encrypted thread on the dark web. Images of Frank had been turned into memes, some respectful, others threatening, a few even digitally altered, used as emotional bait by accounts tied to extremist cells. Frank Adams, retired, quiet, solitary, was now more than a veteran. He was a symbol, and not everyone interpreted that symbol the same way. Back in Whitlock, Frank sat in his kitchen staring at his tablet. His grandson Tyler had sent him a text that morning. "Hey, Grandpa, did you see this? Someone used your clip in an AI-generated political ad." Frank blinked, clicked the link, and watched. His face, his cane, the bag of bread, spliced together with heavy orchestral music and a slogan, "This is what they want to silence." Frank lowered the tablet. His coffee had gone cold. That afternoon he called Sam. "Something's wrong," he said. "I think I'm being used." Sam showed up 20 minutes later, still in uniform. Frank handed him the tablet, already open. Sam watched the video, twice, then closed his eyes and said quietly, "They're building a narrative around you." Frank didn't move. "I didn't ask for that." "You didn't need to. The algorithm chose you." Over the next 72 hours, the clip was re-uploaded over 2,200 times under different aliases. Some used it to sell supplements. Others used it to push agendas, military, political, even anti-government. The distorted versions outpaced the original truth. Meanwhile, on a forum titled vigilantrevival.org, a post titled "Frank Adams, the Last American Man" gathered 1,800 comments. Some celebrated him. Others called for violence. One chilling reply simply read, "If we can find the bench, we can finish the message." The post was flagged, but not before someone geotagged Briggs Field. Sam contacted B-32 directly. He'd served alongside some of the architects, one in particular, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Doran, now overseeing digital ethics enforcement under the Homeland Surveillance Integrity Task Force. They met at a secure facility just outside Columbus. Doran pulled up a heat map of online activity. "Your father's face is now part of at least 13 known AI-disrupted propaganda chains," she said. "Some of it is passive echo traffic, but we've confirmed at least one coordinated manipulation pattern traced to a foreign bot farm." Sam stiffened. "Are we in threat territory?" "We're in contagion territory. Back in Whitlock, someone sprayed graffiti on the field bench. It wasn't obscene, just chilling. He stood. We strike." Frank found it first. He stared at it a long time before getting on one knee and quietly wiping it off with a damp rag. Kyle showed up minutes later. Saw him scrubbing. "You shouldn't be the one doing that," Kyle said. "I'm not doing it for me," Frank replied. "I'm doing it to prove it wasn't left unanswered." At the next town meeting, the mayor raised concerns over emerging digital security risks. Kyle stood up and spoke without being asked. "You don't protect a man like Frank with fences or curfews," he said. "You protect him by not letting the lie outlive the truth." Frank didn't speak. He just nodded. The next morning, a young girl approached Frank outside the diner. "Are you the man in the video?" Frank hesitated. "Which one?" She thought for a second. "The one who didn't fall." He smiled. "Then yes." She handed him a drawing, crayon, crude and honest. It showed a stick figure on a bench, surrounded by others holding hands. She'd titled it, "When People Remember Right." That afternoon, Sam brought Frank a security proposal: motion detectors, cameras with facial recognition, drones set to alert with 92% match confidence using biometric markers. Frank shook his head. "I fought in wars where we feared becoming shadows. I'm not about to live in one just to feel safe." Sam didn't push, but he left the tablet behind. Just think about it. B-32 has thresholds. If your signal goes above a certain frequency, they have to act, even without your consent. Frank stared out the window. What if the signal never drops? Sam didn't have an answer. At a B-32 roundtable 2 days later, Lieutenant Commander Doran reviewed the situation. "We're not dealing with terrorism," she said. "We're dealing with digital hijacking of narrative symbols. This isn't about harming Frank Adams. It's about owning what he represents. They want to weaponize dignity." A younger analyst offered, "Should we suppress it?" No, Doran replied. We amplify the right version, show the full story, the forgiveness, the bench, the bus, the volunteer shifts. We fight AI shadow clones with unfiltered truth. So they re-released the footage, not the slap, not the Blackhawk, but Kyle driving the van, Frank wiping the bench, a child saluting, a town standing. They called it Still Standing, the full story of Frank Adams. And in the first week, it got 3.4 million views. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. Frank watched it once, alone. He nodded quietly, then turned off the screen. No need for applause, just peace. But the final frame stayed with him. You can't control what the world says, but you can live a life that contradicts it. That night, someone knocked on Frank's door. It was Kyle, holding a laptop. You need to see something, he said. Frank hesitated. What now? Kyle opened the laptop. On screen was a live feed. Someone was walking toward the bench, phone out, live streaming. The caption read, "The place where America got weak." Frank stared, then reached for his cane. I'm not going to stop them, he said. I'm going to sit down first. If you believe truth doesn't fade in the shadows, but waits to be seen again, leave a number 10 in the comments. Because real legacy isn't viral. It's what endures when the noise is gone. The letters never stopped arriving, long after the noise faded. Not just the fan mail or the formal invitations. These were different. Plain envelopes, no logos, no printed headers, just handwriting. The kind that trembles slightly, like the pen was heavier than the hand expected. Each one addressed the same, Mr. Frank Adams Whitlock, Ohio. Some had full return addresses, others had only initials, and a few came from nowhere, their stamps half torn or smeared with rain. But they always found him, and Frank, in his usual way, read them all. The first came from Montana, a man who served in the same battalion as Frank in 1991. He never spoke during those years, never even made eye contact, but he remembered the day Frank stayed behind to repair a stalled APC under fire. I didn't thank you then, so I'm doing it now. My son's alive because you fixed that engine. Frank folded the letter slowly, pressed it into a shoebox beside his bed, and whispered, "One down." Then came a letter from an 11-year-old in Illinois. My teacher showed us your video. At first, I didn't get it. But then I saw how you didn't fight back. You didn't need to. You were already strong. It was signed with a drawing, a small stick figure with a cane, standing beside a bigger one in full armor. The caption read, "Same strong." Some letters bled ink. One came from a veteran's widow in Arkansas. He watched your clip 5 times in a row the week before he passed. He never spoke much about the war, but that night he said, "This guy knows what quiet means." It was the last thing he said to me. Frank held that one longer, didn't cry, just exhaled slowly, and placed it on top of the others. Sam noticed the pile growing. "Why do you keep them all?" he asked one afternoon, watching his father file another envelope without a word. "Because some people only speak when they know someone's listening." "And you listen?" Frank looked up. Every word. One day, Frank received a letter without a name or address. Inside was a crumpled photo of a younger man in military gear standing beside a blast crater. On the back, only 2 words. Still healing. He didn't need a name. He folded it gently, slid it into his coat pocket, and carried it with him for the next 3 weeks. Kyle brought a letter to him once. Not his own. It had been left anonymously in the back seat of the shuttle van. It read, "My father served with you. You probably don't remember, but you wrote his family after he didn't come back. I still have that letter. You told us he stood between others and danger, not because he was fearless, but because he was first to move. I'm learning how to move now." Frank read it twice, then handed it back to Kyle. "Keep that one." Kyle hesitated. "Why?" "Because I think you'll need it before I will." Frank had started storing the letters in old cigar boxes labeled by state. New York had the most. Texas followed closely, then California. A few came from outside the U.S., a medic in Poland, a translator from Kandahar, even a former adversary who wrote in broken English. We once fought opposite sides, but your silence was the first sound of peace I recognized. Frank stared at that one longer than most. He didn't file it in a box. He framed it. By mid-January, the VA had created a digital archive called Voices to the Bench, a place where people could submit letters to Frank, or to the town, or even to their own memories. The site crashed 3 times in its first week. Marla Jensen at B32 called it a non-linear testimony model, people confessing, apologizing, healing through an avatar of resilience. Frank called it mail with a soul. But not all letters were kind. One envelope held only this: "You made them soft. You should have hit back." Frank didn't react. He burned that one in the fireplace, not from anger, but because some words shouldn't be passed on. The most surprising letter arrived by certified mail, stamped from Washington, D.C., from the Office of Congressional Ethics. Inside was a formal invitation. "We invite you to speak at the National Veterans Integrity Summit this April. We believe your story speaks to the moral thread still binding American service." Frank folded it once, then twice, then didn't answer. Sam found it in the trash the next day. "You turning it down?" Frank nodded. "They don't need more speeches. They need more benches." Weeks later, Kyle asked if he could read one. Frank handed him a stack. Kyle opened one from Utah. "My son came home from the Middle East last year. Can't sleep, won't talk. But we watched your story together, and for the first time he asked me something. He said, 'Dad, do you think I could just be like that guy?'" Kyle blinked, folded the letter, said nothing. But Frank saw the tears. The shoeboxes eventually became too many, so Frank turned one room into what he called the listening room. No furniture, just shelves of envelopes, and a single bench in the center. One day, a student journalist asked to visit. She expected a story. She left in silence. Because truth doesn't always need headlines. Sometimes it just sits quietly and waits for you to notice. The last letter in this chapter arrived late February, postmarked from a correctional facility. Kyle had recognized the penmanship before he even read the signature. It was from the man who once stood beside him the day of the slap, the one who laughed, did nothing. Inside, "I never apologized. I watched it all happen and didn't lift a damn finger. But I see you now, man. Driving old guys around, picking up bags. Hell, you became the guy you hit. I'm not there yet. But I signed up to start. Thank you for taking the hit so I could wake the hell up." Kyle held the letter like it weighed more than it should have. Frank watched him. "You okay?" Kyle nodded slowly. "Yeah, it just feels like redemption writes back when you least expect it." Frank nodded. "Only if you leave the mailbox open." That evening, Frank sat at the field bench as snow began to fall lightly. He pulled a small envelope from his coat, unsealed. Inside was a single blank sheet. No words, but folded with care. He smiled. Sometimes the silence is the message, and sometimes that's enough. If you've ever held on to a letter longer than you held on to anger, drop a number 11 in the comments, because some words arrive when the noise is gone, and they still find you. Some towns remember with statues, others with silence. Whitlock chose both. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony with cameras or a viral wave orchestrated by some PR firm. No, it happened the way real memory does, slowly, steadily, and when no one was watching. It started with a bench. The one Frank had sat on that day. The day everything broke open. Someone sanded it. Then someone else replaced the worn screws. Then, without announcement, a plaque appeared. This is where stillness stood. No name, no date, but everyone knew. The postmaster started delivering mail differently. He used to drive right by older veterans' homes. But now, every Friday, he parked and walked each driveway, said hello, asked if anything needed carrying. "Frank's bench changed how I see porches," he told his wife one night. "They're not just front doors. They're waiting rooms for stories we keep ignoring." At Whitlock Elementary, a teacher named Mrs. Elridge added a new morning routine. Before the pledge, she'd ask her third graders one question: what's something quiet that matters? The answers ranged from saying sorry to letting someone go first in lunch line to not laughing when someone trips. One morning, a student said, "sitting with someone when everyone else walks away." No one prompted that. Mrs. Elridge just looked out the window toward the flag. Briggs Field became a quiet pilgrimage site, not touristy, not manicured, just sacred. People didn't speak loudly there. They didn't litter. Kids stopped running when they got close. And veterans sat longer than they used to. One day, an old Navy cook left his cap on the bench. No note, just a gesture. 2 hours later, a young girl found it. She brought it to the rec center, and they put it in a shadow box above the welcome desk with the label, "Worn, but not forgotten." Kyle didn't slow down. If anything, he worked harder. He doubled his shifts, added night runs to shuttle older veterans from dialysis and therapy. But what changed most was how people greeted him now, not with suspicion, but with recognition. He wasn't the guy who messed up. He was the guy who showed up after. And that made all the difference. One morning, he found a note taped to the van windshield. "You drove my granddad last week. He said you opened the door before he asked. Said no one's done that in 10 years. I just wanted you to know." No name, just a grateful granddaughter. Kyle folded it into his wallet, where Frank's note had lived for months. B-32 closed its active case file on Whitlock, but not before submitting one final summary report to the Ethics Oversight Committee. Subject community transitioned from incident response to cultural recalibration. Impact measurable via independent behavioral audits, educational reform patterns, and digital narrative divergence from extremist echo clusters. In simpler terms, the town didn't just change. It stayed changed. Frank didn't talk much about legacy, but one Sunday morning, as Sam walked him to the bench, Frank said, "Funny, isn't it?" Sam looked at him. "What is?" "How a slap can echo longer than a speech." Sam chuckled. "Depends who's listening." Frank pointed at the field. 2 boys were helping a third up after he fell. No mocking. Just hands. "They are," Frank said. Letters still came, of course. The latest was from a therapist in New Jersey who now used the clip of Frank's story as part of trauma recovery sessions for veterans struggling with moral injury. They see your face and realize stillness doesn't mean surrender. It means choice. Frank pinned that one beside his kitchen window, next to a picture of his wife, and the last postcard he ever mailed to his grandson, Tyler. One day, the mayor called Sam. "We're considering renaming Main Street." Sam frowned. "To what?" "Adams Way." Sam paused, then shook his head. "Don't name it for him." "Why not?" "Because he'd hate it." The mayor sighed. "Yeah, I figured. Okay. What about this?" "What?" "Let's not name anything. Let's just act like we remember." Sam smiled. That he'd love. Frank passed away 2 springs later, peacefully, quietly, in his sleep, holding a pen. Halfway through writing another letter, this time to a man in North Dakota who had written, "My father served with you. I think he would have liked to meet you." The final words Frank wrote were, "He would have liked you too." That page now sits in Whitlock's small library, inside a glass case labeled "Letters That Never Needed a Stamp." At his memorial, no one wore dress uniforms. It wasn't forbidden, just understood. Instead, they wore denim. Work shirts, the things Frank would have chosen. The only formal thing was the bench. Someone had wrapped the backrest with red, white, blue cloth. A single sign taped beneath the plaque. Still here. The mayor didn't speak. Neither did Sam. The only person to take the mic was Kyle. He cleared his throat once, then simply said, "You don't have to wear a uniform to carry something sacred." After the service, people lingered. No music, no scripted goodbye, just footsteps. Hugs. Stories passed like torches. A girl left a paper flower on the bench. An old woman traced the wood with her fingers and whispered, "Thank you." A teenage boy sat down and read one of Frank's letters aloud, to no one in particular. And somehow, everyone heard it. Weeks later, B32 quietly requested to use Whitlock as a model for community-based civic eco-resilience. They called it Operation Legacy Bench. But internally, everyone at the agency referred to it by another name, the town that remembered. That story would be told in classrooms, in therapy sessions, in quiet moments between fathers and sons, between soldiers and civilians, between the person you used to be and the one you're still trying to become. Because Whitlock didn't forget. Because Frank didn't just sit on a bench. He built one, for the rest of us to remember what standing really means. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that some legacies don't need monuments, just memory, drop a number 12 in the comments. Because some towns aren't built on roads. They're built on people who refuse to walk away. Sometimes, it takes a single moment to show us who we really are. Not the loud, polished version of ourselves we post online, but the quiet decisions we make when no one's watching. One slap, one bench, one man who refused to retaliate, not because he was weak, but because he understood that silence, when chosen, can roar louder than violence ever could. This wasn't just Frank Adams' story. It was a mirror held up to all of us. Would we stand up when it's inconvenient? Would we kneel beside someone when everyone else walks away? Would we protect dignity even when it's wrapped in an old coat, walking with a cane, and barely noticed? Frank never asked for fame. He didn't fight to be remembered. But in doing nothing, he reminded us of everything. He reminded us that dignity doesn't retire with age, that respect isn't given to uniforms. It's earned in the moments when no one is clapping. And most of all, he reminded us that legacies aren't built from medals. They're built from presence. Frank's story didn't end with a courtroom verdict, or a viral clip, or even with a plaque. It ended with a town that changed, not because it had to, but because it chose to. A bench became sacred, a mistake became movement, and a man who had every reason to be angry became a reason for others to heal. And in a time where we're surrounded by digital noise, where AI can replicate faces and bots can stir hate before breakfast, that kind of presence is revolutionary. No biometric scanner, no drone footage, no algorithm could have predicted what happened next, because what followed wasn't coded, it was earned. Frank reminded us that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about patience, that redemption isn't loud, it shows up early, drives the van, opens the door, and most importantly, that the stories worth telling aren't the ones that go viral. They're the ones that refuse to be forgotten. In a world obsessed with speed, Frank moved slowly, and still changed everything. And now, maybe the most important part of his story is yours. Because you're not just watching a story about a veteran and a bench, you're watching a story about choice. When your moment comes, and it will, what will you do? Will you be the one to laugh and walk away? Or will you be the one who kneels, not to show weakness, but to honor the strength it takes to still care? Will you recognize when your silence is costing someone their dignity, or worse, their voice? In today's world, where deep-fake videos can rewrite reality, where algorithms tell us what to think before we've even had the chance to feel, this kind of story cuts through. Why? Because it's real. No CGI, no PR spin, just a man, a bench, and the ripple effect of integrity. That's what we need more of. not just online, but in our towns, in our schools, in our families. And maybe, just maybe, we should ask ourselves, what if the legacy we're leaving behind isn't written in tweets or posts, but in how we treat someone when we think no one will ever find out? So here's what I invite you to do. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something you didn't expect, leave a number 5 in the comments. Not for us, for Frank. For every quiet person who stood their ground without needing applause. And more than that, share this video with someone who's forgotten what stillness means. Someone who might need reminding that some battles aren't won with fists, but with character. Because here's the truth. Not all heroes wear uniforms. Not all justice comes from the court. And not all echoes fade when the noise dies down. If you've ever looked at someone and underestimated what they've carried, if you've ever chosen silence because speaking up was too uncomfortable, if you've ever thought that one small act of kindness wouldn't change anything, then let this story prove you wrong. Because a town remembered, because a man forgave, and because someone, somewhere, maybe even you, is watching what happens next. So I'll ask one final time. If you believe this story needs to be remembered, leave a 5. If you think forgiveness is still stronger than revenge, share it. And if you're ready for the next story that proves quiet, people change the world, subscribe. Because the world doesn't need more noise, it needs more Frank Adams. Let's make sure this isn't just a moment. Let's make it a movement.